The year is 301 BC. The Fourth War of the Diadochi had ended in the decisive Battle of Ipsus, which had resulted in Antigonus' defeat and death. The Antigonid Kingdom subsequently crumbled as Demetrius chose to abandon Asia to the Allies, instead choosing to retreat to Greece to try and maintain his rule there. For the next decade, the regional players of the Hellenistic world would all make bids for Macedon itself. Demetrius would immediately set sail from Ephesus, intending to return to Athens, as with them he had left his ships, his money, and his wife Diadochi. Though as he approached, ambassadors from Athens intercepted him and advised him to turn back, as the people had declared an edict denying any king entrance into their city. Demetrius, however angered, agreed. He was in no condition to avenge the ill treatment. In response, he sent envoys asking for the return of his galleys. As soon as he had received them, he set sail for Corinth, but found his affairs there in an even worse situation. The cities of the Peloponnese were expelling his garrisons and were pledging loyalty to his enemies. Demetrius' situation was dire. His grip on Greece was slipping, but more importantly, his army was no longer being paid and was on the verge of mutiny. In an attempt to salvage the situation, he would leave Pyrrhus in Greece with part of his army, hoping he could try to stabilize the region. Meanwhile, Demetrius himself sailed with the bulk of his army against Lysimachus' heartland in modern-day Gallipoli. He would ravage the peninsula, as Lysimachus was still bogged down in his newly conquered territory in Asia Minor. The quick campaign both enriched and secured the loyalty of Demetrius' own troops, which now began to gather strength and improve into a respectable army. Lysimachus was greatly troubled by Demetrius, though now with Antigonus dead, the other kings no longer viewed him as a threat. Seleucus would try to seek an alliance, sending proposals of marriage to Stratonice, the daughter of Demetrius. This was partially in response to Lysimachus' marriage to one of Ptolemy's daughters himself, and taking the other for his son Agathocles. Nevertheless, a connection with Seleucus was an unexpected turn of fortune for Demetrius. He would take his daughter and immediately set sail with his whole fleet for Syria. On his journey, out of necessity, he would several times make landfall on the coast of Cilicia. Pleistarchus, the brother of Cassander, who had been granted the land after Ipsus, was greatly outraged by the incursions and would depart immediately to Cassander to complain of Seleucus for having reconciled himself to the common enemy without the agreement of the other kings. Once Demetrius was informed of his departure, he marched inland and seized the former treasury of the Antagonids in Anatolia, where he would find 1,200 talents before returning to the sea. Seleucus met Demetrius at Erosus. Their interview was conducted in a sincere and princely manner, without any marks of design nor suspicion. At its conclusion, Seleucus took Stratonice as his wife and departed to Antioch. Demetrius, having concluded matters with Ptolemy through Seleucus, also agreed to marry Ptolemy's daughter Ptolemaeus. They also agreed to exchange hostages, which resulted in Pyrrhus, Demetrius's brother-in-law and claimant of the Epirot throne, being sent to Egypt. As Demetrius departed from Syria, he landed and seized the province of Cilicia, before sending his first wife, Phila, to her brother Cassander to answer the accusations brought against him by Plistarchus. In the meantime, back in Athens, the city had become divided into political factions. Taking advantage of the division, one of the most influential leaders, Lachares, would seize control of the government and would rule as a tyrant. Once the news reached Demetrius, he aimed to once again begin hostilities against Athens. Though the siege would initially result in little, and he would depart with a portion of his army to besiege several cities in the Peloponnese, which had revolted against him after the defeat of Ipsus. Demetrius's incursion into the Peloponnese discouraged their merchants from assisting Athens, further increasing the famine that was already beginning to plague the city. Ptolemy, although now friendly with Demetrius, would send a fleet of roughly 150 ships to the aid of Athens, hoping to gain goodwill with the Athenians. After the great fleet arrived outside the city, it suddenly appeared that the Athenians were saved. But Demetrius's own navy was soon bolstered by a great reinforcement of ships coming to Demetrius from the Peloponnese and Cyprus. Ptolemy's fleet, not wanting to risk battle, quickly weighed anchor and steered off. At the same time, realizing the situation, the tyrant Lachares would make his escape and abandon the city. The Athenians, though they had made a decree that no man under pain of death should mention peace or reconciliation with Demetrius, now opened the gates nearest him and sent ambassadors to his camp. Not that they expected any favor from him, but they were forced to take that step by the extremity of the famine. Despite Athens' betrayal of him, the terms he placed on the city were most agreeable. Demetrius, having regained a sufficient position in Greece, marched his army back into the Peloponnese and finished his campaign, subjugating the entire northern part of the island, from where he turned his army south and now aimed to conquer Lacedaemon and planned to march on Sparta itself. King Archidamus would march to meet him, though Demetrius would win a decisive victory, putting the entire enemy army to rout. As Demetrius approached Sparta, he would once again win another decisive victory, putting the defeat of Sparta all but in his grasp. Though fortune would not favor him, soon news came to Demetrius that informed him of Seleucus' capture of Cilicia and of Ptolemy's invasion of Cyprus, which had resulted in its complete conquest, except for the city of Salamis, which was now besieged. The news would force Demetrius to withdraw from Laconia, though there was little Demetrius could do, and Salamis would fall in 294 BC. In 297 BC, Cassander, the longtime ruler of Macedon, would die, he would be succeeded by his son, Philip VI, though his son would not outlive the year, dying later in 297. He would be succeeded by his two remaining brothers, Antipater I and Alexander V, both of which were sons of Thessaloniki and were decisively at odds with each other. In the same year, Ptolemy, always looking for allies and hoping to capitalize on the situation in Macedon, would send Pyrrhus with an army to Epirus, with the goal to reclaim his throne from Neoptolemus, who had revolted and drove out him and his supporters in 307 BC, when Pyrrhus was 11. And now, 10 years later, Pyrrhus returned to Epirus at the head of an army, but not wanting to fight a civil war, he came to terms with Neoptolemus and agreed to rule Epirus together. Though soon both kings started to plot against one another, Pyrrhus was informed of a plot against his life and decided to strike first. He invited his fellow king to a dinner and had him murdered. The act does not appear to have been unpopular, as Epirus's nobility seemed to have been fully devoted to Pyrrhus. Back in Greece, the rivalry between the two brothers intensified, and Antipater would murder his mother Thessaloniki and drive Alexander from Macedon, who would subsequently ask for assistance from both Pyrrhus of Epirus and Demetrius from the Peloponnese. Pyrrhus arrived first and would drive Antipater from Macedon, from where he would escape to Thrace, before being killed by Lysimachus. Alexander would seize the throne, and in payment for his assistance would grant Pyrrhus several provinces in western Macedonia. After Pyrrhus had retired, Demetrius also entered Macedonia. Alexander met him at the city of Dion and received him in the most respectful manner, but told him that he no longer required his presence. Alexander was understandably scared of Demetrius, and the latter was always ambitious. As Demetrius was going to supper with Alexander, he became informed of a plot against his life. Demetrius subsequently took his guards, who were much more numerous than those of Alexander. Alexander's people, intimidated by his retinue, dared not to attack Demetrius, and the next day Demetrius prepared to leave. Alexander rejoiced that he was going away voluntarily, without any hostile intentions, and accompanied him as far as Thessaly. When they came to Larissa, they renewed their invitations. In consequence of these polite maneuvers, Alexander chose to not go with the guard, that he should teach the other to do the same. He suffered that which he was preparing for his enemy. As they left, Demetrius's guards killed Alexander and his friends who attempted to assist him. One of them is reported to have said as he was dying, "Demetrius is but one day ahead of us." As dawn broke the next day, the Macedonians were horrified to hear of the fate that had befallen Alexander. Though Demetrius would make no appearance of hostilities and sent messages desiring to speak with them. Demetrius warmly welcomed the Macedonians, and the Macedonians themselves, soon realizing they had no better prince at hand, declared Demetrius king of Macedon. Demetrius also received news that Ptolemy had sent his wife and children, who had been captured at the fall of Salamis, back to Greece. Demetrius was now king of Macedonia, Thessaly, a large part of the Peloponnese, and the cities of Magartha and Athens. The only cities who still defied his rule were the Boeotians, who he subsequently threatened with hostilities. At first, they proposed he come to terms with him, but soon Cleonymus arrived with a Spartan army and entered the town of Thebes. The Boeotian spirits were raised, and at the instigation of Pessus, they broke off the treaty. Demetrius, enraged, quickly marched on the city and began preparations for a prolonged siege of Thebes. Upon his arrival, Cleonymus, greatly intimidated by his army, retreated from the city. The Thebans, who were now greatly outnumbered, immediately surrendered. In Asia, Demetrius's daughter, who was initially married to Seleucus, was now married to his son Antiochus, who now was elevated and ruled as co-king with his father. In Thrace, Lysimachus, who had spent most of his reign fighting Thracian revolts and incursions from the barbarians, now aimed to launch an invasion north, hoping to expand his realm beyond the Danube. Lysimachus would cross with an army into Getae land. Although the expedition saw initial success, his son Agathocles' force was ambushed and he was taken prisoner. The Getae king, Dromachatis, would soon release the prince with gifts. Lysimachus, however, pressed on and captured a sizable area beyond the Danube before his own army was ambushed, and Lysimachus himself was taken prisoner. The Getae would set him and his army free in 292 BC, on the condition he would return the territory he had captured beyond the Danube and give his daughter to Dromachatis, the king of the Thracians. Once Demetrius heard of Lysimachus's capture, he would quickly march towards Thrace, hoping to find it in a defenseless state. But soon he gained news that Lysimachus had been released and was already back in Thrace. He immediately turned back in anger and found on his return that the Boeotians had revolted against him and had already been defeated in battle by his son Antigonus II. Demetrius would march in Thessaly and once again laid siege to Thebes. However, Pyrrhus, realizing the opportune time, invaded Thessaly and advanced as far as Thermopylae. Demetrius was forced to leave the siege to his son Antigonus and marched with his army against Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, in return, quickly withdrew from Thessaly back to Epirus. Demetrius placed a guard of 10,000 foot and 1,000 horse in Thessaly before returning to the siege. His first operation was to bring up his machine called the Helepolis, a massive siege tower. But the size and weight of the tower prevented any quick movements, and the tower proved a burden. The Boeotians made a vigorous resistance, and Demetrius launched several attempts to capture the walls, with varying levels of success. Demetrius himself received a wound from a lance that pierced through his neck. This gave him excessive pain, yet he continued the siege, and finally, after demolishing part of the walls with his siege engines, the city would fall to Demetrius. Thebes had been taken twice by Demetrius, then it's 10 years since being rebuilt by Cassander. In 290 BC, Demetrius would launch a campaign against the Aetolians. He ravaged much of the country and left a respectable army there to continue the campaign. Demetrius withdrew and planned to march against Epirus. Pyrrhus, likewise, was marching to meet him and liberate the towns in Aetolia. The two armies managed to take different roads and passed within several miles of each other. Demetrius would go on to lay waste to Epirus, and Pyrrhus subsequently would march on the army left in Aetolia. The two armies would meet in 288 BC. Both armies would be matched in equal number and strength, though at the end of the day, Pyrrhus's troops would prove decisively victorious, defeating his adversary and capturing roughly 5,000 prisoners before returning to Epirus. Despite his inability to dislodge Pyrrhus, they would agree to a peace treaty. For now, Demetrius's position in Europe was strong, and he still had ambition of a reconquest of his father's kingdom, and began making preparations for an invasion of Asia. From Macedon and Greece, he managed to conscript an army of roughly 98,000 foot and 12,000 horse, and was building a fleet of 500 galleys in the ports of Macedon and Greece. Once the news of his preparations and plan reached the other Diadochi, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus, realizing the danger he once again played, formed a coalition against him. They also invited Pyrrhus to join them, desiring him to march upon Macedon and to ignore the treaty he had recently made with Demetrius. As Demetrius was preparing for his voyage, he soon received news Ptolemy had arrived in the Aegean with a large fleet and was now just off the coast of Greece. Lysimachus had invaded Macedon from the east, and Pyrrhus was invading from the west. Demetrius hastily left his son Antigonus II with an army in Greece and marched with his army to try and hold Macedonia. He first marched against Lysimachus, but once the news Pyrrhus had taken Beroea reached him, discontent quickly spread amongst his army, which mainly consisted of Macedonians. They began resenting their king and were on the verge of mutiny, many wanting to march off and join Lysimachus. Demetrius, realizing his army would not fight Lysimachus, quickly turned and hoped to march against Pyrrhus. Lysimachus was Macedonian, but Pyrrhus was not. He thought the Macedonians would never betray him for Pyrrhus. After encamping his army near Pyrrhus's, he soon realized he was mistaken. The Macedonians resented Demetrius and admired Pyrrhus, who they thought of as a true king and thought resembled Alexander the Great. Parts of his army began to defect privately and in small parties. But soon there was nothing but open disorder and mutiny in the camp. Demetrius, realizing the situation was hopeless, mounted his horse and departed. Subsequently, upon the appearance of Pyrrhus, Demetrius's entire army willingly submitted to him. Demetrius fled to Caesarea before returning to Greece to try and rebuild his force. Subsequently, Lysimachus and Pyrrhus agreed to divide Macedonia between them. As Demetrius returned to Greece, he attempted to gather the remnants of his rule and managed to reform an army of roughly 11,000 men. Leaving his son Antigonus II once again in charge of Greece, he collected all his ships and embarked his army, aiming to sail to Asia. His army landed at Miletus, and many of the cities opened their gates to him, and many others he took by force, including a siege of Sardis. Seeing his success, some of the officers of Lysimachus deserted him and brought sufficient quantities of money and troops with them. Lysimachus soon sent his son Agathocles with a large army into Asia. Demetrius initially marched to Phrygia with an intention to seize Armenia. Though Agathocles shadowed his army's movements and began cutting off his supply convoys, which created a widespread famine throughout his army. Eventually, the supply situation became so dire, he was forced to turn back. He marched to Cilicia, and upon coming to Tarsus, he attempted to spare the country because it belonged to Seleucus. But because of the dire state of his army, it was impossible for his troops to avoid taking food from the region. Demetrius composed a letter to Seleucus containing detail of his misfortune and asking if Seleucus would let him remain in the territory until they could find sufficient food, as Agathocles had fortified the mountain passes, effectively trapping him in Cilicia. Seleucus was touched with pity and initially sent orders to his lieutenants to help supply Demetrius and his army with sufficient provisions. But soon Seleucus, still cautious of Demetrius, marched with his army into Cilicia. Demetrius, terrified by the sudden change of Seleucus, withdrew to his strongest positions upon Mount Taurus and sent a messenger to him, begging to permit him to winter in Cilicia. Though Demetrius was still short on supplies and continued to ravage the country, Seleucus, hoping to displace Demetrius, launched several small attacks, which all resulted in defeats for Seleucus, and not wanting to risk battle, he was forced to withdraw from Syria. Demetrius, seizing the opportunity and emboldened by his victories, pursued, and after a short battle captured the Syrian gates. Emboldened by another success, Demetrius prepared to fight a decisive battle with Seleucus. He made a feint of moving back into Cilicia, but afterwards in the night he decamped and crossed the mountains into Syria. Seleucus followed and encamped his army nearby. At dawn, the two armies assembled for battle. Both armies were deployed in the standard Macedonian formation, with both Demetrius and Seleucus commanding their respective right wings. Before the battle could begin, Seleucus, moving in front of his army and laying aside his helmet, presented himself to Demetrius's troops, with only his shield in his hand, trying to convince them to join him, and that it was to spare their lives. Demetrius's troops, which were starving and tired, agreed, upon which they all saluted Seleucus as king. In a desperate attempt, Demetrius initially made an escape with his closest friends, but realizing his situation was hopeless, soon surrendered to Seleucus. Seleucus would treat Demetrius like a king, and he would be exiled in Syria Nevertheless, after 3 years' confinement, Demetrius would die in 283 BC. Demetrius's death would prove the last time the Diadochi would unite against a common enemy, all turning their eyes once again to Macedon, as the Hellenistic world would become decisively divided, sowing the seeds of their own defeat.